Welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from in the world. And thank you for joining this GroundWork Policy Briefing for Action section. The recording has started, so please be aware that we are recording this session so we can share it later with all of you. Today's conversation on transition minerals, indigenous rights, and biodiversity builds on the foundation we have laid over the past 2 years through the GroundWork series, and we have worked to connect global policies with local realities and evidence with lived experiences. GroundWork, if you are new to this space, is a collective initiative by the International Climate Politics Hubs, ICPH, Sit for Change, and TINTA. It is supported by the Climate and Land Use Alliance, and it is collected by Dr. Philippa Bailey and myself. Philippa, you want to say hi? Maybe you want to open your camera. If you have not met Philippa before, Philippa Bailey.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining today. I'll be in the background with Paula. We might just want to wait a couple of minutes to make sure that everybody's had the chance to enter the room before we dip into the content. I'll be sharing links on the chat, so I will share the links already with the materials that Paula spoke about from our briefings last year.
Exactly, and just some housekeeping as we wait for the rest of the participants to join, is that we have a Q&A, so feel welcome to introduce yourself in the chat, tell us where you're calling from, but all the questions, please use a Q&A button so it helps us, especially the team working in the background, to identify the questions and be able to channel them to the panelists during the Q&A. So maybe some of you are familiar with our work. We started working in 2023, doing policy briefings. Since then, we have reached a lot of people across different regions, and all our briefings are multilingual. We have a fantastic interpretation team. If you are not already in your right channel, please go at the bottom of your screen where you have a little globe and you can choose the language of your preference. Please do that now if you haven't done that already. Okay, so I think that we can start maybe by talking a little bit about why are we focusing on this topic and why are we talking about it now. We are 3 minutes, and we have just maybe probably half of the audience we're expecting for today. We had over 350 people registering for this webinar, but as you know, usually we expect a third of the audience. So I think we can start just diving into, we have a very busy agenda with excellent panelists joining us today. So it would be great if we could get started with a presentation as well. So why this topic and why now? And for you who were in the previous 2 webinars from last year, we discussed this topic extensively and the recordings are available. We will also have some podcast version of the recordings of last year, so you can just listen to it in 25 minutes instead of 90 minutes. Those are not ready yet, are coming soon, but they're available. So why are we talking about this topic and why now? Why now? We see that in the last year, the energy transition is accelerating, continues to accelerate. And with it, the demand for lithium, cobalt, nickel, and copper is soaring. According to the IEA Global Critical Minerals Outlook from 2025, the demand of these minerals will triple by 2030 and quadruple by 2040. So triple by 2030, that's only 5 years away, and quadruple by 2040, reshaping the geography of extraction. Recent research shows that how deeply this expansion is unfolding across indigenous territories. A 2024 mapping study from the Extractive Industries and Society found that nearly 60% of all critical minerals worldwide are located in areas where indigenous peoples hoard or are negotiating consent rights. A 2025 follow-up confirmed that these overlaps are increasing as new projects target remote and biodiversity-rich zones. This is worrying, this is concerning, and it's important for all of us at the GroundWork that we follow this story, follow this theme at the speed it is evolving. In Latin America alone, the lithium triangle holds up to 85% of the known reserves. 85% of the known reserves fall within or near indigenous territories, with similar patterns emerging in the Congo Basin and Indonesia. This concerning growing evidence makes clear that indigenous governance, consent, and participation are not marginal considerations. They are central to the legitimacy and sustainability of the global transition, of the global energy transition. Yet the pace of extraction is advancing far faster than the regulation. Things are happening very, very quickly, and our systems and our regulation are not keeping up. We are not implementing policies and safeguards fast enough. For example, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center 2025 Transition Minerals Tracker record 731 allegations of human rights and environmental abuses in the sector. Nearly half involve indigenous or local communities, and 38% related to violations of free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, while attacks on defenders continue to rise. At the same time, the geopolitical weight on transition minerals, as we know, has deepened. The war in Ukraine is an example, and the fight between the US and China also puts that in evidence. While minerals have always held a strategic value, their importance to global power dynamics has intensified. Control over extraction, refining the trade, is now shaping alliances, investment flows, and climate diplomacy. Regions such as the Lithium Triangle, the Congo Basin, and Southeast Asia have become focal points of competition between producer and consumer countries, often through state-backed investments and new trade instruments. This scramble for access frequently bypasses local governance and weakens environmental and social safeguards, particularly where rights to land, data, and benefit sharing remain unresolved. It underscores the need for a right-based global framework that balances energy security with justice, stewardship, and indigenous sovereignty. This is why we're here today. In a latest report by Global Witness, we were warned about how this mineral rush risks repeating the injustices of the fossil fuel area. We're just changing one thing for another. We're not really creating the safeguards to ensure that we are not repeating extractive practices that have damaged our planet for so long and put at risk the life of many. This report, the Critical Minerals Scramble documents, how underregulated extraction is already fueling conflict and deepening inequality across the global south. If the energy transition is to succeed, it must be a just transition, one that decarbonizes without dispossession. On the other hand, the UNEP Finance Initiative similarly cautions that weak mineral governance can create systemic financial risk, turning social harm into market instability. And we're already seeing this in many parts of the world. And the UN Secretary General Panel on Critical Energy Transition Minerals from 2024 calls for a governance model where, grounded in equity, in FPIC, and protection of high-value ecological and cultural areas, we can maybe change the current paradigm into something sustainable and equitable for all. Together, these principles form the backbone of a just transition framework, one that aligns with decarbonizing with justice, rights, and planetary care, might take us into a better world, into a better direction, into a better future. Finally, from a biodiversity perspective, the World Economic Forum 2025 Nature Positive Mining Report finds that 1 in 3 planned mineral projects, 1 in 3 planned mineral projects overlaps with high conservation ecosystems, 1 in 3. while the WWF deep sea mining analysis concludes that seabed extraction remains fundamentally incompatible with a global biodiversity framework. So things are happening quite fast and impacting the planet at all different levels, right? Forest, water, marine. And this is not the safeguards to help us address this speed is not allowing us to, everything is happening faster than the safeguards and the policy spaces that we create. There is a lot of information in this presentation, and all the links are probably being shared now by my colleagues on the chat, but will also be shared in the presentation that you will receive. The presentation will be translated to different languages. We will incorporate the presentations of some of the panelists or all the panelists, and then you will receive probably tomorrow the recording of this webinar together with the links to the presentation. So just for you, it's like if I'm giving you a lot of information because I am, you don't have to worry about the links. You will have them all in the presentation as well. Let's go to some regional evidence. So these global patterns are visible across regions. In the Amazon basin, mining for transition minerals, especially copper and lithium, now spans Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Bolivia, and Venezuela. According to Amazon Mining Watch, over 2 million hectares of forests have already been affected, with more than a third of this loss occurring in sites adjacent to indigenous or protected areas. In Ecuador, large-scale copper projects such as the Mirador and San Carlos Patanza have caused forest clearing and conflict in Shuar regions, in Shuar territories. In Peru, lithium and copper concessions are expanding into fragile Andean headwaters that feed the Amazon. And in Brazil, mineral extraction has grown more than 1,200% since the 1980s, expanding faster near indigenous lands in Pará and Roraima. In Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo supplies nearly 70% of the world's cobalt, much of it from areas overlapping forests and protected reserves. There are studies from C4 and UNEP show that every hectare directly mined, basically up to 4 additional hectares are lost. So for every hectare mined, up to 4 additional hectares are lost through associated infrastructure and secondary loss of land, secondary land use. In Asia, as you probably have seen the news as well, the nickel boom in Indonesia has driven widespread deforestation. Production has grown 8-fold since 2010, with significant loss across the whole Sulawesi and Halmahera areas. Similar dynamics are seen in Philippines, where new copper and nickel concessions overlap indigenous territories and mangrove ecosystems. These examples point to a very clear shared pattern. The mineral rush for renewals is colliding with the world's last intact ecosystems and the indigenous territories that sustain them. Indigenous territories act also as buffers. And there is more and more evidence about how powerful these territories are against deforestation and biodiversity loss, including that driven by mining. Global analysis estimate that indigenous territories have prevented at least 25 million hectares of mining-related deforestation over the past 2 decades. 25 million hectares prevented. In the Amazon alone, research published found that indigenous territories and protected areas avoided over 27 million hectares of deforestation between 2000 and 2015. That's an area roughly the size of the UK, the United Kingdom. Studies by RRI, the Rights and Resources Initiative, and the World Resource Institute, WRI, show that forests under indigenous stewardship store roughly 1/4 of the world's tropical forest carbon and have deforestation rates 2 or 3 times lower than unprotected areas. Securing collective and land tenure these reports emphasize, is one of the most effective and affordable climate and biodiversity strategies available. To uphold this protection, recognition must evolve into regulation. Recognition is not enough. Acknowledging is not enough. We need action, we need regulation. As transition mineral frontiers expand, there is a growing discussion about the need for legally enforced no-go zones. Zones where mining and other forms of industrial extraction should simply not be permitted. Now, this concept can sometimes sound a bit controversial because historically, protected or restricted areas have been used in ways that exclude local and indigenous communities from their own lands. But that's not what we are proposing here. That's not the concept we are bringing to this forum. We are talking, when organizations, for example, like SIRGE, RRI, call for no-go zones, they are referring to territories that indigenous peoples themselves identify as off limits of all industrial activity based on their own governance systems, FPIC processes, and cultural and ecological priorities. This isn't new. Indigenous organizations have been campaigning to protect their territories and preserve them from damaging extractivist practices for a very long time. But this concept now is becoming a cornerstone of what it implies to go into regulation and practice beyond recognition. In other words, this isn't about a top-down restriction. It's about legally recognizing and protecting areas that communities have already determined to be incompatible for extraction. Seen this way, no-go zones become a tool for affirming territorial sovereignty, safeguarding ecosystems, and ensuring that the energy transition truly reflects the principles of a just transition, one rooted in rights, consent, and care for the land. Our 4 speakers today represent organizations working to turn these principles into policy and action. The SIRGE Coalition calls for FPIC to be treated as an absolute right, for permanent no-go zones to be established in ecological and culturally vital regions, and Indonesia's leadership to guide all decision-making. Ahead of COP30, SIRGE is urging the Brazilian presidents to embed these priorities in the Just Transition Work Program. The Natural Resource Governance Institute and NRGI exposes how corruption and opaque licensing systems drive both inequality and environmental harm. LACLIMA in Brazil advances environmental law, climate justice, and indigenous rights through litigation, training, and policy design. And Global Witness leads advocacy for supply chain transparency, corporate accountability, and defender protection. Its current work focuses on embedding mineral governance within the COP30 Just Transition agenda. This initiative demonstrates that even amid complex political realities, there are real opportunities for collective influence. Elevating mineral governance within climate negotiations, aligning finance and trade within human rights and biodiversity goals, and building a shared vision for a renewable future rooted in rights and equity, respecting FPIC and respecting indigenous sovereignty and territorial rights. This conversation continues, as I said earlier on, continues from a thread from last year's GroundWork sessions on energy transition, where we discuss transition minerals as a base conversation. Then we also talk about narrative for change. In last year's sessions, which you have the links in the chat, we explore how governance and storytelling shape political possibility. This year, the Harmony Labs conducted a narrative analysis and confirmed that media portrayals of the energy transition still prioritize innovation and inevitability, while the impacts on indigenous people and biodiversity remain largely invisible. GLUA support this study about transition minerals narrative, in which Harmony Labs have been mapping how this issue is showing up in news media, in industry and policy communications, and their new analysis from 2022 to 2024 confirmed that the media portraits of the energy transition still prioritize these two topics, and the impacts, they only refer to only 2% of the coverage of the media analysis mention Indigenous people. So only 2% refers to Indigenous peoples. Most of it focuses all the time on innovation and the inevitability factor of this transition and the need for renewable energies. So reframing, and I'm bringing that not only because we would love you to watch the other webinars and just continue the conversation, but because also just to bring to attention that we need to reframe the transition story of as it is told today, and focus on the importance of stewardship, consent, and planetary care, which are three things that are missing in the story that we are being fed by the media nowadays. This is not only of cultural relevance, but is a strategic move. So that is why we are here today. Enough of listening to me. Now I'm going to welcome the speakers and introduce the panel. And we have today, we're honored to be joined by four extraordinary people bringing really more information, more depth to this topic. We have Yblin Escobar from the SIRGE Coalition. We have Ana Carolina González Espinosa from NRGI. We have Emily Stewart from Global Witness. And we have André Castro Santos from LACLIMA. André, I think, is a little bit late. He has not arrived yet, but he will be here with us very, very shortly. We have designed today's webinar, so we have time for the speakers to do the presentation, but also for you, audience, to ask the questions you want. So once more, I invite you to please write your questions in the Q&A section as they come. Don't leave it for the end, because my team will help me organize the questions so we can ask the panelists and you can hear the information you are waiting to hear. So each speaker will speak about 10 minutes, more or less, and we will begin with Yblin, who will open our discussion by grounding us in Indigenous leadership and FPIC, the foundation of any just and rights-based transition. Yblin will speak about how Indigenous movements are working to strengthen enforcement of FPIC and advance permanent no-go zones in areas of high ecological and cultural value. I just have a message that André has arrived, so thank you, André. I don't know you're here, but we will start with Yblin now, who is here with us now. So please, Yblin, go ahead. You might need a few minutes to share your screen. There you are, Yblin. Lovely to see you. Welcome.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. Anchagredesheiki Alimpunchai. My name is Yblin Roman Escobar, and I serve as policy lead at the SIRGE Coalition. If I can upload my slides, please, just give me 1 second. And if you let me know if you see my slides.
Yes, we do. Perfect,
Yes.
Yblin, thank you. Yes.
Okay, so I will address in my time advancing Indigenous people's rights and strategies in the climate discussion, and more broadly in the energy transition. As you have mentioned, Paola, Indigenous peoples have a lot to say and play a central role, or should play a central role in the discussion. But as you mentioned, and as the colleagues of Harmony Labs have shown, we are not in the story, and that should change. I'm going to start by very briefly introducing my organization. And even before introducing my organization, I would like to start by paying my respects to all Indigenous peoples all over the world whose perspectives I am bringing to this discussion. When we think about the SIRGE Coalition, it's responding to the needs of Indigenous peoples that we came to life. We are a coalition of Indigenous leaders, Indigenous-led and allied organizations, and our primary goal at the coalition is advancing Indigenous people's rights to self-determination, and particularly the right to free, prior, and informed consent. For this, we provide a platform for Indigenous peoples to build power. We provide direct support, also economic support, engage with companies and investors, and we bring them to commit to respect the rights of Indigenous peoples and hold them accountable to their commitments. We build community and solidarity. We advocate in various spaces such as the European Union. For example, we specifically worked in the European Union on the battery regulation, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the Critical Raw Materials Act, where we got some references to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous people's rights. We also have supported the Permanent Forum on the UN Secretary General Panel on Critical Energy Transition Minerals, and also we work with the civil society in the what we call the hub on the same objective. One of the defining characteristics of our coalition is that we are guided by an Indigenous Peoples Council, comprising different Indigenous leaders from all 7 sociocultural regions of the world, which means we have the representation and the voices from all over the world. We have also an executive committee who operationalizes the guidelines given by our Indigenous Council. And when we came to life because of the challenges you have introduced in the first section, Paola. We saw that these challenges were coming like a tsunami on Indigenous people's territories. And we came together to support Indigenous peoples the best way. And what we see is that this tsunami, this drive toward the green transition has sparked an intense global competition for mineral resources. And this has raised tensions. China remains the dominant player in mineral processing. It maintains a leading position in refining raw materials. The US and the European Union are also important players, and they are now apart. But they remain heavily reliant on China for processed material while simultaneously racing to reduce their dependency. In these efforts to reduce their dependency and decoupling the efforts has fueled narratives centering national security, supply chain sovereignty, and this has led to the pursuit of energy dominance at any cost. As a result, we see a fierce global competition and rising political tensions every day, and there is more and more mining. Some of it's just pushed for the sake of mining itself, and that's a real risk for us on the ground. When we think about this exponential growth, we see a lot the use of terminology that it's not neutral. Critical minerals, for example, these critical minerals that are driven by the twin transition, is often used to highlight the importance of these minerals. But another terms that are being used are development minerals, trying to tie these minerals to the SDGs, for example, or green minerals. We do not use these terms because we want to challenge the narrative pushed by the mining industry. We have been referring to these minerals as transition minerals because they are being used for the energy transition. However, we increasingly see that a large portion of these minerals are being used for other purposes, such as military, defense, and ever-increasing demands for AI infrastructure. We therefore see that even the term transition minerals is becoming misleading. At the end, we should just use minerals. Also, and we see, but because of the use of these critical or transition minerals use of the language, we focus on a very heavily carbon tunnel vision, which overemphasizes the emission reduction at the expense of broader environmental and social factors. And if you see the life cycle perspective, greenhouse gas reduction is only one impact category. You have water, you have resource use, you have landscape change. And when I think about this, I think about Johan Rockström, which is the rock star of the planetary boundaries. And he said, even if we do everything right for the climate change, we are going to fail if we don't take care of nature. And it's actually the integrated package that we have to take care for. And that is critical for us. It's water, it's biodiversity, it's life, and it's our Mother Earth. It's the integrality of the package. That's important. Please keep that in mind, because that drives all of our actions, our priorities, and our strategies. We are also seeing, that's important to mention, a shift towards unilateralism from a nationalization. And this is important because the multilateral agreements provide defense and safety for indigenous people's rights. But when we come to a level of nationalization, we see that deals are done behind the doors and only at national levels, and many countries respect indigenous people's rights, but many don't. So we are confronted to individual states respecting or not, mostly not, indigenous people's rights, and advancing and pushing this fast-tracking agenda at all costs. You have used already this scheme, but it's really important. And what we see here, you are going to drop the reference in the chat, right, Paula? Because I can also do that later.
Yes, we have. It's in the PowerPoint. Thank you, Yblin.
Yes. In the graph, what we see is different bars. The yellow area mark lands that are legally recognized as indigenous people's territories in percentage. The green shows areas owned by peasant communities. The blue part represent territory shared by indigenous peoples and peasants or land-connected peoples. And the purple section are the only areas that are not indigenous or peasant or land-connected peoples. And you see immediately that this is really a small fraction of the total. Why is this important? Along the x-axis, you find the different minerals and metals. Many of them are central for the energy transition. But I told you, why is this important? What this figure makes clear is that for nearly every mineral shown, they are located on indigenous people's territories. Globally, we say 54% of energy transition minerals are on or near indigenous people's territories. It is 66% for copper, but that is an underestimation, because what you see in green is many indigenous people's communities that are indigenous, but are not recognized as indigenous. So there is a blur between the yellow and the green, but what we can say for sure is that most of energy transition minerals or minerals are going to be on our homes, in our gardens, and that make us again very important in the discussion. But our work is very difficult because, as you say, we should be central, but we are in less than 2% of the conversations in the media, the narratives, and some things that make our work really difficult are wrong narratives. Here in red, you find the common narratives that we have to fight, like, for example, more mining is really the climate solution, or all transition minerals are for renewables, or this one is very strong, indigenous peoples' opposition slows progress. Indigenous peoples are against development, or mining is the only option. and it justifies mining everywhere. What we have to concentrate is that the transition is becoming an energy addiction, actually. And renewables are added to. So we are talking about an energy addition instead of an energy transition. And that indigenous peoples are not a block to the progress. We defend biodiversity, we defend our rights, we defend life and keeping the whole global community within planetary boundaries. And scarcity is totally constructed. We have to think not only in terms of mining, but using what we already have on the ground, which is recycling, circularity, and starting by reducing our demand to begin with. But we go to the next. We go to what you have focused on the introduction, on the strategies that we have to advance the rights of indigenous peoples, and it's always the same. They didn't change. We have been working with them, and it's always these are all variables in the formula that we have to take into account, that is that we are defending our lands and biodiversity, that we have to build the free, prior, and informed consent protocols. We have in SIRGE produced a guideline. I'm going to drop also the link in the chat. We are working, as I mentioned, with corporations and investors to explain them the importance and the risks for them when they do not respect the free, prior, and informed consent, and how this is a material risk and how they can avoid this by respecting indigenous people's rights and making it clear that indigenous people's rights do not oppose to projects or to all projects, that free, prior, and informed consent means yes, yes with conditions, or no, and that's not unequal to veto, and by strengthening community. As an example, illustrating the point you have mentioned in the introduction about the no-go zones, I would like to highlight here a process that is going on that illustrates the efforts of indigenous peoples towards the COP30, but not only, where all Amazon communities come together and declare to the world and to the parties what they want. And they prepare demands that are important for the Amazon region in Latin America, but also other tropical regions in the world. And they focus on 6 points. Well, many points. I'm going to drop the references in the chat. The first is the recognition and protection of all indigenous peoples' territories, especially the territories with the presence of indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation or initial contact, what we call the PIACI, pueblos en aislamiento. And this should be a climate policy action. For indigenous, and I'm going to read a section on that. For indigenous peoples, the territory goes beyond a physical space, they explain. It is a sacred place where all beings coexist in harmony, uniting the spiritual and the material, the individual and the collective, the past, the present, the future. In this integral relationship with the land that makes the good living and a full life to be built, and that are essential for the preservation of our planet. The demarcation and full protection of indigenous peoples' territories, especially those in voluntary isolation, are effective climate policies and guarantee our rights, and they strengthen the balance between biodiversity conservation and climate balance. It's important, that is central. The second is direct financing and financial autonomy. Because the truth is that when we talk about money, money does not come to indigenous peoples. Even money that should be directed or that is promised for indigenous peoples, for example, take the climate fund. There is 1.7 million promised for indigenous peoples and local communities, recognizing the great role that indigenous peoples and other local communities play in conserving forests, which are important in the fight for climate change. How much of this budget comes to indigenous peoples? It is less than 1%. Less than 1%. And in international cooperation, it's typically 2%, 3%, less than 5%, depending on the country. So we are always in the 1 or 2% everywhere. How strongly are we in the narratives? 2%. How much money do we receive? 2%. What is our participation in the spaces? It's not big. Probably it's going to be also in the same range. 3, representation and effective participation. Indigenous peoples should be fully at the table. They should have full, equitable, inclusive, effective, and gender-responsive representation and participation in all decision-making spaces, really having the possibility to decide. We say many times when we meet that we need to have the spaces at the table, because if we are not at the table, we will be on the menu. So we have to be there. 4, the protection of indigenous defenders. That is basic. You know, our peoples are being killed simply for defending our Mother Earth, for defending our rights, for defending what is life. That cannot be. It's like killing our immune system as a global community. We have absolutely to defend our indigenous defenders. Next is the inclusion of our knowledge. We are experts. We have thousands of years of experience on the ground. And we have the solutions. When it comes to problems, we have a complex situation, but we have solutions for every context. So in the inclusion of our indigenous knowledge system should be part of the game. The next and the last is the exploitation-free zones in indigenous peoples' territories that are no-go zones. And not only because they are biological hotspots, because they are mostly, because most of the remaining biodiversity is on indigenous peoples' territories, as well as the biogenic carbon sinks, but also because it's part of our culture. It's because it's important for the cultural survival of indigenous peoples' communities. So what the indigenous peoples are demanding is a decree establishing indigenous peoples' territories as areas free from extractive activities in order to protect life, to protect indigenous people's rights and ecosystems, and the declaration of indigenous peoples' territories as exclusion zones from extractive activities because they are particularly important for biodiversity and ecosystem functions, but also they are important in cultural terms, and this is relevant for the Amazon, but also for Congo, also for Borneo, Mekong, Southeast Asia basins, and for all the regions that are highly biodiverse in our world. Here I put many additional resources, and I will be happy to continue this conversation in the following sections. I will leave it there in the interest of time. I think I'm still in my time.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Yblin. I have lots of questions to ask you, and I would love to continue this conversation, but we also have to open the floor for other speakers and leave time for the Q&A. I do have one very punctual question, and it's in terms of all these needs and all the strategic priorities and all the things that need to be emphasized. In terms of opportunities, for example, now with the COP30 just a few weeks away, How can Indigenous networks working at local and regional levels connect more effectively with this kind of global processes, as I said, like the COP, for example, but it's not the only one, to make these safeguards non-negotiable, to really push for these no-go zones, to push for FPIC, to change the 2%?
Yeah. Strength is in numbers, and we are united. We are united and we are organized. We have a caucus, an Indigenous Peoples Caucus, that is very active and it's producing proposals. It's bringing proposals to the table. And in terms of what we need is implementation, implementation, and implementation. Our priorities are clear, are very clear. There are context-specific differences. For example, in Argentina, the situation is not going to be the same as in Sweden or in Congo or in South Africa, but the principles and values are the same. At the pre-COP, we will have an important space to advocate, and many Indigenous leaders will be there advocating for Indigenous people's rights in the caucus. Indigenous peoples are already and have been already engaging with states to advance our priorities. And I'm going to mention a list of demands that we have and could potentially influence mineral governance if implemented correctly. In any document, we have to push for Indigenous peoples as enumerated in the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this should be referenced in the operative text, not only in the preamble and not only in annexes. That is central. We have to be in the action. The same, it's applicable to any document, the Critical Raw Materials Act in the European Union, the UN Secretary General panel. We are not in the action point, in the actionable recommendation points. We were there almost, but we lost it. But okay, for example, in June, in the session of Bonn, the subsidiary body issued an informal note, and this is quite strong, but it misses some points. And these are the points that we recommend for any document. We need strong references to Indigenous peoples, particularly self-determination and free, prior, and informed consent. We also need strong references pointing that Indigenous people's rights must not be sacrificed in the name of energy security strategies.
Yes.
We also need that the text doesn't commit to we need to make it clear that the fossil fuels need to be phased out, and we need a plan, and we need clear targets and timelines. Indigenous peoples are also calling for explicit recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation and initial contact, as I mentioned. I repeat this because this is a very important part, and you don't have to look for free, prior, and informed consent in this case, because you cannot approach Indigenous peoples. You have to apply the precautionary principle and simply don't go there. That is a no-go area. The current proposed concept note I mentioned does not address the negative impacts of mining and renewable energy infrastructure associated with energy transition on Indigenous lands. And the program should do that, should affirm respect for Indigenous people's rights to self-determination, to FPIC. It must also explicitly reference and affirm that the rights of Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation are not negotiable. And lastly, we need to expand the rights of Indigenous peoples beyond voluntary measures. It should be binding. And we have to incorporate new elements, new principles. For example, the UN Secretary General panel on critical energy transition minerals report and recommendation. Make a strong call for all stakeholders to respect Indigenous people's rights, but also centralize the rights-based approach. That is the point.
Thank you so much, Yblin. Thank you so much for reminding us that, Indigenous consent and leadership must be at the center of this conversation. Thank you so much. And implementation, kind of mantra that we need to repair To continue, we look at the economic and governance dimensions of the transition. So I will now like to invite Ana Carolina to share her perspective on how transparency, fiscal policies, and anti-corruption measures can ensure that this mineral wealth contributes to sustainable development and rather than deepening inequality. So Ana Carolina, please join us.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you, GroundWork, and on all of the organizations present here and all of the participants for inviting me to this very vital conversation. And as you said, I'm trying to share my PowerPoint presentation. Please let me know if it is working.
Yes, it is working. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Yes.
So, as you said, mineral governance is essential not only for economic justice.
Sorry, Ana. Excuse me, Ana Carolina. You might want to press the sharing the little icon to view the presentation in presentation mode.
Okay, let me.
Yeah, that one there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
You lost it again, so you have to click again. Went back to before. Slideshow. Yes, that's the slideshow.
Okay. Okay, cool. Yeah, so as you said, governance is very important for not only for economic justice, but for biodiversity conversation. So I would like to center my intervention around what are the governance challenges that we need to prioritize or that we need to think about prioritizing, and maybe also some opportunities that might emerge from this conversation in terms of how civil society, indigenous organizations, and other actors can explore to strengthen mineral governance. And so I wanted to start by, I don't know if this is moving. I wanted to start by sharing what is at stake, but of course you have already mentioned a lot of those figures, so I won't go in detail on that, about these overlaps between reserves, mineral reserves and forest, and the fact that this is overlapping not only with biodiversity hotspots, but also with indigenous communities, as also Yblin mentioned, which is already happening in our countries, right? But then let me move to what I think could be the governance challenges associated with this new boom. Because of course, and what I wanted to mention, I want to start by highlighting socio-environmental challenges, because when we think about socio-environmental impacts of mining and what are the challenges that we're facing, we might tend to think, okay, it is the same as usual, right? Because we have had so much experience about mining extraction and how mining extraction have produced important impacts over human rights, corruption, lack of equity in the distribution of benefits, lack of participation, important impacts over waters, and etc. But it is important for us to understand what is different now, or what do we need to prioritize, because otherwise the agenda becomes so big that we then don't know where to start, right? And at NRGI, what we do is that we work at across 13 countries. We work at the country level, and we work also at the regional and global level, trying to identify policies and practices and narratives that could ensure that the mining sector actually benefits civil society, benefits citizens, and benefits these communities that have been often marginalized from decision-making and from these benefits. And we work with civil society organizations, we work with governments that are prone to implement reforms, and we also work to promote multi-stakeholder dialogue, including different actors. We do that through research, we do through capacity development, through advocacy, through building coalitions, to challenging narratives. But again, if we don't have clarity on what are the priorities that we need to tackle, then we might spread all too thin. And so one of the main issues here that I wanted to highlight in terms of social environmental challenges is like how can we understand what are the specific impacts that we want to make sure are on the top of the agenda, to be able to work together as a collective to put them on the radar. For that, I think it is important to mention that, yes, the impacts are very similar to what we have observed in the past. And so social environmental governance and regulation and etc. Should follow the learnings from the past and different practices that we have learned for so long. But if we identify certain issues, then we are able to identify where are the governance innovations that we need to emphasize, right? And one of the main concerns that we have with transition minerals is precisely because the fact that they are considered these energy transition minerals so vital for the fighting against climate change, force sometimes governments and force many different actors to overlook the social environmental standards that have been fought for so long and in the past, right? At the same time, I think it is very important to observe a specific context and see what are the areas where these policy innovations are needed. And let me just mention two, because of course this is very context specific and we could not choose two priorities for the world, but we could try to identify what are common trends. One for me is definitely what we have been discussing, biodiversity loss and deforestation. And again, it's not new. There has been impacts on biodiversity loss and deforestation from mining in the past. We know what has happened with nickel exploitation in Indonesia for years, right, in terms of deforestation. But the fact that we have mining expanding into new areas, into new very sensitive areas, just put this challenge at a more acute level, right? We have, for example, the example of copper, right? Because now we are facing low-grade type of ores. In the case of copper mines need to look for new areas to explode, and they might need additional amount of land to get the similar amounts of copper that they used to have, which is a smaller amount of lands, right? And so that expansion in the case of copper calls for additional measures for us to take. And of course, Yblin has already mentioned, and I know that other panelists will mention, but in this case, because of the expansion into new areas and because of all of these overlaps, one of the main policy tools remains this definition of no-go zones at the enforcement of FPIC, as it would be mentioned. But at the same time, where mining is already happening or where it's going to happen because of this situation, how can we make sure that these new mines in these new areas we improve social environmental governance for that? And one of the things that keep us up at night is like, how do we integrate better biodiversity conservation policies and considerations and indigenous rights into mining policies in a more deliberative way? How those environmental licensing contracts, how these processes change to consider biodiversity is something that we need to start to consider. Another example is water. Again, a very relevant impact from mining in the past, but we know, for example, that 80% of copper exploitation in Chile overlaps with water-stressed areas, right? And so in terms of social environmental governance, if we know that water is going to be a very important issue, then we might need to start exploring new tools for water governance. How does this change environmental impact assessments? How can we integrate better cumulative impacts in that? Because we know that today, those environmental impact assessments are done just by each project. So they don't consider the overall impact of other projects in the same territory. How can we integrate better these cumulative impacts into individual projects? Or can we try new forms of participatory water monitoring, like we have seen in Peru, where communities actually create their own baseline data, collect and assess water quality, and engage in discussions with companies and with authorities against these results and using these results. So we need to innovate in these tools, but again, we need to know exactly what are the things that we want to prioritize. The other governance gap or challenge that I want to highlight refers to how we know the risk of corruption can increase in these cases. We know that the market, and again, corruption is a risk in mining like for years, right? But we know that in particular, this transition in minerals, the markers for this transition in minerals tend to be opaquer, tend to be more concentrated in few companies and in few players. So the corruption risk increase because we know less about how these markets work, right? And we have seen already when there are commodity booms, that the booms also increase the possibilities of higher corruption risk. And if we only take a big, the big picture, the Congo Not for Sale Coalition have estimated, for example, that DRC lost $1.3 billion from 5 corrupt mining deals that took place between 2010 and 2012. This is equal to twice the country's combined health and education budget for 1 year. So we are talking about massive, important amount of money that is key for civil society and for citizens. And we also know that, sometimes we talk about money, but we know this corruption risk can also have important impacts on environment and communities. We know, for example, that in Chile, one of the leading lithium companies made nearly $50 million in improper payments to political figures and others connected to them. They used that to influence legislation in favor of the mining industry, including regulations regarding water use that we were talking about, right? So we need, again, to tackle this because this is going to impact these regions, these unique ecosystems where indigenous peoples are located and that depend on these water resources to sustain their communities. And corruption risk can include risk associated to social environmental impacts, for example, affecting social environmental impact assessment, or corruption might be related to the manipulation of community consultation, to undue private influence over laws, or concealment of environmental damage and avoidance of responsibility of rehabilitation, corruption in contracting. So it means that we need to explore new tools for governance to reduce corruption risk by, for example, enhancing transparency and publicly available social and environmental data and information on mining and processing, by strengthening participatory monitoring of licensing and operations, or introducing, for example, policies to prevent conflicts of interest when it comes to assigning these mining licenses. And we know this is a global phenomenon, so we also need to address these foreign enablers of corruption and social environmental harm through mandatory due diligence laws for companies. And I'll mention a little bit of that at the end of my intervention. But we know governance is not just about risk, and I just wanted to highlight finally in terms of benefits that we also need to ensure that benefits are shared more equitably. And governance is also part of that, right? And of course, that can include, as in the past and as always, clear fiscal rules that ensure the maximization of revenues for the country, but also ensure that this distribution of money reach the local communities. And here are many experiences that we can explore in terms of community benefits agreements, actually where indigenous organizations have left very innovative pathways in terms of community benefit agreements, examples of community benefit agreements in Canada that have worked, others also with some difficulties. There is not magic tool here, but also experience of co-ownership, like the ones we have in Canada or Australia, where indigenous communities own corporations hold stakes in service contracts or have equity in a mining project. We know also in terms of economic benefits that there is a very important conversation today from many countries that want to make this boom different, especially trying to leverage the geopolitical race in order to increase the state shares and move up into the value chain, creating value-add addition projects. But again, this should be an opportunity for the civil society and indigenous organizations to engage and ensure that these economic linkages and these new industries and projects benefit people and that they provide employment for youth, women, and indigenous communities. And I would like to close this intervention, colleagues, by sharing maybe some opportunities that we are observing in general at the global level to put these governance topics and areas at the forefront of the climate discussions as well. The first thing I would like to say is that we need to be working more closely together, right? We need to build better connections between organizations working in resource governance, working in human rights, working in promotion of indigenous people's rights, working in biodiversity. We know priorities will be different in each country or territory and that we have all different approaches, but we know we can be more powerful in advocacy if we maybe prioritize certain things and work together around that, but also because a lot of South-South learning would be required to understand how these different tools and innovations work, right? I mean, in some cases they might work, in some cases they cannot, under which conditions they work. This is a lot that we need to learn together. The second is, as it was already been mentioned by Yblin, the implementing of the UN Transition Mineral Guidance and Recommendations that was released by the UN Secretary General Panel on Critical Energy Transition Minerals. I think it is very important that this panel plays mineral governance at the top of the climate agenda and that they situate, I quote, the integrity of the planet, its environment and biodiversity as needed to be safeguarded. And as an interconnected elements to the principles of human rights, justice, economic development, anti-corruption. They call for this new paradigm and they explicitly mention the importance of declaring protected areas, no-go zones for transition minerals, and call for equitable targets and timelines for circularity approaches and etc. We need to call on that panel, on those who participate in the panels and others, holding these UN agencies accountable to further advance, as Yblin said, in the implementations of these principles. The third is improving due diligence. We know that consumers are increasingly expecting companies to carry out due diligence, and we have the OECD due diligence, responsible supply chain of minerals from conflict affected and high-risk areas framework, and we have many other standards. The international community needs to ensure that these due diligence standards include mining governance and especially stronger anti-corruption measures alongside the provisions to protect forests and biodiversity. But I think we have a specific opportunity today to propose more binding mechanisms that go a bit beyond all these voluntary initiatives that we see around. Within the framework of the UNEA, Colombia's government has been proposing to create an expert group that could identify opportunities or options for international instruments, including global and legally binding instruments for coordinated global action on the environmentally management of minerals and metals. And I think there is still time before and during UNEA for us to continue putting pressure on decision makers there to raise in ambitions towards a binding instrument that could go beyond these voluntary measures. And finally, I think the last point is joining what Yblin already mentioned, which is how do we integrate minerals governance and biodiversity in just transition frameworks? And yes, I think there is an important opportunity today about that we are working closely with many other organizations to use the Just Transition Work Program at COP30 to make sure that a reference is made to minerals. So mineral governance is integrated as part of climate efforts. But I would also say that there are opportunities to promote the inclusion of mineral governance into the many instruments that governments are now building around just transition, including, for example, JET peace. We know, for example, that in the case of Indonesia, biodiversity was mentioned into the JETP, the Just Energy Transition Partnership. How can we ensure that these financial instruments are also used to bring additional resources to the protection of biodiversity as part of this quest to promote just transition? And with that, I close, Paula, and happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Ana Carolina. Again, lots of questions, a couple of questions for you in the chat, but we will move them to the end so we have time to listen to the other speakers. But thank you for showing us how the importance of minerals governance, and also to bring in this experience from Colombia, where we have like binding rules, binding instruments that can coordinate global action, the proposal for that. So thank you for that. We will have questions for the audience at the end. So now I would like to invite Emily to help us connect this national and regional experience to the international stage. Some of the examples have been mentioned before, but I would like us to reflect a little bit more on how global accountability mechanisms can anchor transition mineral governance with a broader Just Transition Work Program. Welcome, Emily.
Hi, Paula. Thanks very much for having me. And first of all, may I say a big thank you to GroundWorks, the Invisible Thread, and Seeds for Change for setting this up, and encourage others, if they haven't already watched some of the other webinars that GroundWorks have produced, to have a look at those, because they're a really, really great resource. I've watched them myself and they're really useful. I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint, but while I get that going, I will already kick off and say, we've heard quite a lot about the rush for demand and how that's rising, but it might be useful to think a little bit about where that demand is coming from, because it's not necessarily a new thing. Obviously, we know that the Chinese have been central for quite some time to a lot of these supply chains, right from mine to manufacturing. And this has been something that they have been putting in place for really more than a decade, both seeing the potential for demand rising from renewables, but also for other consumer goods as well. And so the Chinese have had a big head start on everybody else, but they're not the only geography who have been thinking about how they can make sure that they get their hands on all of these materials. And in the last few years, we've seen plenty of other both unilateral efforts and multilateral efforts to think about how particularly high consuming countries can make sure that they're at the center of receiving these goods. So in Europe, where I'm based, in Brussels, a couple of years ago, we had the European Critical Raw Materials Act, which was Europe's potential answer to how they would spread their influence around the world and be able to access minerals, which they largely don't have within their own geography. We've also had the Mineral Security Partnership that was initially set up by the US under Biden, is now apparently still alive under Trump, but seems to be functionally basically dead in the water at this point, which was, and again, a club of both high consuming countries and mineral rich countries, which was supposed to come together to facilitate the transfer of minerals. And of course, we've seen the US has been very active in this area. Before Trump, we had the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which was supposed to really double down on the US's own production of renewables. And then we've seen Trump come in, and I can't say that I think he's particularly keen on renewables. And so probably the demands to take over Greenland, to annex Canada, and to get involved in conflicts in Ukraine and DRC and Haiti and other places is more to do with gaining that strategic advantage over China than it is about decarbonizing the US's own economy. But there are some positive moves towards multilateralism as well. Yblin talked about the UN Secretary General's panel, and this really was an encouraging move, and it was also done at lightning speed, if you know how slowly things normally happen within the UN. But this was a genuine attempt to bring together multiple types of stakeholders from high consuming countries, resource-rich countries, but also trade unions, Indigenous peoples' organizations, and civil society to come together and think about some actionable recommendations, and to begin to set up something that might look like a multilateral framework. Some of you might also be familiar with the UN's environmental programme and know that in the past there have been attempts there that have been largely unsuccessful to introduce ideas around multilateral governance for minerals. Soon, for the next UNEP, we know that Colombia will be tabling something like this. For the time being, it looks as though this might mostly be a call to set up another expert examining group, but it does show that we've got plenty of these sorts of seeds being planted where countries are thinking about this sort of thing. And we're also seeing the G7 and the G20 acting. The G7 under Canada's presidency released a document this year thinking about what a roadmap for sourcing minerals for the G7 might look like. And the G20 is releasing some really great stuff under the presidency of South Africa about what responsible mineral stewardship might look like. Now, I have to say, for me, these aren't my favorite platforms to be thinking about these questions for a few reasons, because they are quite exclusionary in their nature. The G7 is a club of 7 rich countries trying to get their hands on minerals. And the G20, even though it's being led by a global South nation who's thinking through these issues really quite carefully, is still a club which excludes other nations. And so, although I know that the UNFCCC is by no means a perfect platform for many, many reasons, not least that fossil fuel lobbyists seem to be able to infiltrate the platform year after year. And it's also been 10 years since the Paris Agreement was signed, and we're really no further in terms of reaching any of our decarbonisation goals. I still remain to be optimistic about this as a platform because it is the only place where all countries, in theory, are represented equally and can all bring their views to the table and all have a say on what happens next. And for that reason, I've spent quite a bit of my year looking at COP30 and how we might embed the question of minerals in the process. Because believe it or not, although it has been a decade since we signed a climate agreement, which, yes, is about reducing emissions and moving away from fossil fuels, it's also about moving towards renewables. And we know that the technology and the materials that underpin this are the minerals that we've been talking about all day. And yet, no mention of minerals, mining, processing, any of these things has ever featured in any of the texts of COP. But I still think, more on COP30 now, still think it represents an interesting opportunity for a few different reasons. It is one of the only international binding instruments that we have, and so getting something on minerals in here is meaningful. Now, those of you who are listening will probably find it reasonably obvious why a climate text might want to think about something like minerals. Again, our previous panelists have talked about the climate impacts, particularly that issue about Indigenous stewardship and how that has an impact on climate and environment when you take that away. And so those links are quite clear probably to this group, but I think it's worth saying that they're really not clear to everybody. Minerals and the question of minerals and mining has largely been treated as an environmental issue or a development issue or a human rights issue. And it hasn't really been tackled by the climate community before. I'm hoping our host will be able to drop a couple of resources into the chat for me that we've developed, because we've been trying to get the sorts of people who come to these conferences to think about these climate questions. And as such, we've developed 2 different resources. One is a kind of expert paper which basically backs up why we're saying this is a climate issue and brings together all of the disparate science around issues such as, why digging up your old growth forests, your tundra, your peatlands has a CO2 impact. Also, why mining itself is CO2 and greenhouse gas intensive, and why Indigenous people and their rights are at the heart of ensuring that we don't accidentally make more climate harms in the process of trying to unpick the ones that we've done. So we've put that expert paper together, but we've also put a policy paper together aimed at the kinds of policymakers who maybe attend COP, on a yearly basis, but they really only think about COP for those couple of weeks that they're there. And perhaps when they go back to their home countries, they still have to address these questions, but not in this UN forum. And so I would definitely encourage you to take a look at those and see if they can be used in your own advocacy. At COP itself, we've identified a couple of interesting opportunities. So First up, we were rather hoping that this sort of thing would be addressed by a covering decision, as is often the case with big questions, particularly questions that have never been addressed by the UNFCCC before. But the Brazilians have explicitly said that they don't want to do covering decisions this year, explicitly because they can be seen as being quite a top-down instrument, but implicitly also because actually the Brazilians are thinking about their own capacity and the questions there. So a covering decision looks like it's not possible, but what is potentially possible is the new emergence of something called the Just Transition Work Programme. And because this really addresses questions that are at the heart of whether or not our energy transition will be just, we think this is potentially a great place for us to raise this question of mining and processing and the communities who are affected by it. Alongside the Just Transition Work Programme, there's something potentially being developed called the BALEM Action Mechanism, which would give implementation force to the ideas behind the Just Transition Work Programme. There's also something called the Katowice Committee on Implementation Effects, which is supposedly set up to look long-term at the knock-on effects of the implementation steps that we take. And we've been engaging with them as well. We've also heard from the Brazilians that they are hoping this year's COP will finally move us away from the stage that we've kind of been stuck in negotiating and move us towards the implementation stage, and that they might start to develop a roadmap on future implementation. And I think obviously, you know, it's not just about where we're coming from, it's where we're going to, and that is materially based on minerals. And so that would be great to see something in there. But I've also put a question mark here about a COP for minerals, because there is an increasing call, and that won't happen this year. But there is more of a call for potentially a whole separate process which addresses this issue and sets up a multi-stakeholder forum to address this. So what else might the next years bring? Well, there are serious questions about the UN, not only in terms of whether or not some of the processes are fit for purpose, but also the UN has taken some serious hits from the funding cuts that the US has doled out. And so we know, for example, that the high-level expert advisory group that was supposed to be set up by the Secretary General's panel on critical minerals is probably not going to happen now, and that is as a direct result of the funding cuts that the UN is experiencing. However, we also know that UNAIDO, for one reason or another, was not exposed to these cuts and have really waded in to take over the reins of some of this work with their global, sorry, I can't remember the exact term, it's the Global Alliance for Green Minerals under UNAIDO. And at the moment, they're out there calling for participants to be part of that. So do look that up and see if that's an interesting area for your own work and advocacy. I think there is a big question mark over what the G7 will do. Like I say, it's not my favourite forum because of the nature of it being very exclusionary, but nonetheless, it has a number of very powerful countries. And many of the mineral-rich countries that we've spoken about as well don't necessarily always take the best decisions for their communities and their people. And so the G7's call to these resource-rich nations to partner up and offer up their minerals may well be heard by some of these countries. And so it's really important that we're also working on that country level. I think the emergence of the BRICS as well working together, particularly in the wake of what we're seeing with the rules-based order really being challenged in the West. You're seeing China really coming forward, and as it has been for a while, positioning itself as the voice of the global South and sort of teaming up with countries such as Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa. And that could potentially represent a new repositioning of the world powers. And in that scenario, I think China, it's really important that we're also working with them so that, you know, we're thinking about what they might do in the future and what they might implement in terms of multilateralism. Because they are interested in it themselves. At the end of the day, China's economic miracle has occurred because they are able to sell products to the rest of the world. And ultimately, they don't want everybody to be in some kind of big geopolitical fight at all times. Maybe just a couple of final things to say before I hand the floor back to Paula, is that My email address is here. I have a bit of an informal mailing group where I'm updating folks about things ahead of BALEM, so do feel free to drop me a line if you'd like to be included on that. But I've also asked the organisers to drop a link to a letter that's been organised from Climate Action International, from NRGI, and from ourselves and others, which should be sent next week during the pre-COP, which will take place in Brasilia, where we're encouraging negotiators to engage with this process of setting up the BALEM action mechanism for the just transition. And so if you'd like to sign on to that letter, I'd encourage you to do so. Also, if you're going to be in BALEM as well, please do get in touch, because it would be lovely to see some of you there. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Emily. Lots of information here, lots of opportunities as well to engage, to act, to inform yourself. And you have Emily's email as well to get in touch for those who are going to be in Berlin and those who want to be updated of the process. And thank you, Emily, for helping us connect the dots and all these international games playing next to each other and all these opportunities. So from there, from the going, kind of bringing us now to the COP space, let's go to Brazil. Let's meet André, who will bring us to the Brazil national context, where, as we know, political and legal battles over territorial rights are defining what the just transition looks like on the ground. André, welcome.
Hello, welcome, Paula. I'm not being able to start my video. I don't know what's happening.
Okay, we hear you well.
Yeah, no, the video. Maybe the host has to. Now. I think now I'm able. Yes.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you,
Sorry
Paula.
about that.
No problem.
Thank you,
at all.
André, and welcome.
Just a second. I'll share my screen. Yeah. Are you listening?
Yes, we can see that. Yes,
Okay.
and obviously to everybody, we're going to go a little bit over the hour that we had set. Please try to stay with us. If you can't, we'll send you the recording. So I apologize for going extensively, but obviously we had a lot to talk about. Go ahead, André, please.
Okay. I'll try to be brief. So, but starting to good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. And I want to start by thanking the GroundWork and all the organizers of this event for the invitation and creating such an important space for dialogue with indigenous leaders and those committed to defending territories. My name is André Castro Santos, and I am technical director at LACLIMA. LACLIMA is an institute dedicated to researching, developing, disseminating, and implementing climate knowledge and policies through the lens of law, but with a multidisciplinary approach focused on Brazil, Latin America, and the Lusophone countries. I invite all of you to know more about our work in our website, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And well, in the next minutes, I'll talk with a little about the theme of this panel, the mineral transition, territorial justice, challenges, and pathways for action. So, when we talk about the energy transition, we often imagine clean energy as the solution to the climate crisis. But there's another side to the story that we can call the mineral transition. The global demand for minerals like lithium, copper, nickel is growing rapidly, and much of these reserves are located within indigenous territories and biodiversity-rich regions, especially in the Amazon. And if we don't change how development is planned, this new mineral rush could repeat old colonial patterns of exploitation, exclusion, and violence. And that's why we need to talk about territorial justice. So when we speak of protecting territories, one of the biggest current threat in Brazil is the time frame thesis. This legal argument claims that indigenous peoples are entitled to land demarcation only if they were occupying their lands on October 5, 1988, the day Brazil's constitution was enacted. And this interpretation ignores centuries of expulsions, forced displacement, and the traditional mobility of many indigenous peoples. And in practice, it turns the invader into landowners and the original inhabitant into the trespasser. It's an attempt to rewrite history, to erase indigenous presence in favor of agribusiness and mining interests. And even after the Federal Supreme Court, the STF, declared the time frame unconstitutional, the Brazilian Congress approved the law 1471 of 2023, trying to reintroduce the same idea through legislation. And this is not only a conflict between branches of the state, so the judiciary and the legislative. This is a political confrontation over the very meaning of constitutional protection. The Constitution, the Brazilian Constitution, recognizes the indigenous land rights are original rights and not a concession of the state. And today, more than 1,000 territories are directly at risk. What's really at the stake is not just land, but the continuity of people's cultures and the life itself. The 1988 Constitution adopted the theory of the indigenate, teoria do indigenato in Portuguese, which recognizes that indigenous rights to land predate the state itself. And that's why the time frame is, as the APIB says, a machine that grinds history. It denies centuries of indigenous presence, knowledge, and care for biodiversity. And as they written, our history didn't begin in 1988. It goes back thousands of years. Another crucial issue in Brazil is the new environmental licensing law. Instead of straight, this was approved like two months ago. And instead of strengthening environmental safeguards, this new law weakens oversight, limits social participation, and creates dangerous loopholes. And even after 63 presidential vetoes to this law, several unconstitutional provisions remain, and the Congress may overturn some of these vetoes at any time. This law reshapes one of the most important environmental tools in Brazil, and it does so at a moment when stronger and not weaker protection is needed. Two mechanisms in this new law serve as a clear example of what's fundamentally wrong with it. The license by adhesion and commitment, the LAC, and the strategic environmental license, the LAI. So the LAC allows licensing without any prior environmental assessment for projects classified as low impact. And in such cases, the project is automatically approved once the company agrees to certain conditions, and inspections take place only after the project has started and only by sampling. In this undermines the preventive nature of the environmental licensing and turns into a reactive process where problems are addressed only after damage has already occurred. In more specific terms, this violates the principle of prevention guaranteed by the Article 225 of the Brazil Constitution, which guarantees everyone the right to an ecology balanced environment. And the LAI meanwhile, gives political bodies like the Government Council the power to label projects as strategic and approve them through simplified fast-track procedures, even if they have major environmental impacts. So this means large infrastructure or mining projects could move forward without free, prior, and informed consultation, in a clear violation of the ILO Convention 169 and the Article 231 of the Brazilian Constitution. The new law also reduces the participation of agencies such as the FUNAI, IFAN, and ICMBio that are part of the proceedings of the license in Brazil, and allows virtual-only public hearings, excluding the very communities most affected. And the result is a licensing process that becomes political rather than technical, a mechanism that legitimizes decisions already made, just for legitimized decisions already made, not for a real participation. And when licensing becomes a mere formality, the risk of new environmental disasters grows and territories become even more vulnerable. So, license is shifting from preventive to permissive. Speed is replacing caution, and consultation is being ignored. And as a result, with the state's reduced capacity to ensure social and environmental protection, new disasters that occurred in Brazil, like Mariana and Brumadinho, could become more frequent. And without a proper participation and oversight, there is no protection and certainly no environmental justice. And still, there are ways to act. First, the right to free, prior, and informed consent remains fully valid under the ILO Convention 169. No project can move forward on indigenous lands without a proper consultation, and this right must be claimed and documented. It's also crucial to use institutional channels, taking part in public hearings, monitoring legislation, and engaging with the Federal Prosecutor's Office or public defenders whenever rights are violated. And beyond the institutions, we needed to strengthen territorial monitoring networks, build alliances with universities and civil society, and make indigenous leaderships visible and in a very decision-making space. So, and I think for the final message of this presentation is that, like, the energy transition will only be just if it's also a transition of power, with indigenous peoples at the center of the decision making. Thank you, Paula. I give the floor back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all our speakers and to a very engaging audience. There's been lots of conversations in the chat, and there have been also several questions on the Q&A that have been answered by the speakers. May I ask all the speakers, please, to just very quickly open their cameras so I can ask you for some final words and reflections for the audience.
I can
Thank you.
my camera for some reason.
Okay, that's okay, Ana Carolina. We know you're there. So we are now almost closing this webinar, and we are a little bit over the hour. Most of the questions in the Q&A have been answered, so thank you very much to the speakers for doing that as others were talking. I would like to thank all our speakers, interpreters, and all our partners. But before we close this session, I would like each of you just to give us one sentence to remember. What is the most important thing that our audience should remember today? Sorry, and before we do that, to the facilitators, please, can you allow Ana Carolina to open her video? I think she's having problems with that. Axel, maybe you can help us with that. Yes, there she is. Thank you. And we can ping her to the main screen as well. Thank you so much. Right. Now I have you, all of you, and it's wonderful to see you all together in this space, even if virtual. I hope to see you all in Belém, or most of you, because we will be there with GroundWorks, also meeting you as panelists and also meeting the audience. So please get in touch with us if you want to find us. And before we close, I want to first, announce that we have 2 more webinars coming before a COP. So my colleagues are putting the registration links on the chat. One is on AI and indigenous sovereignty, and the other one is the sprint to COP, with a lot of very interesting discussions. And now to close this panel, I would like to invite, in this order, maybe Yblin, then Ana Carolina, Emily, André, to help to share with us one reflection, one thought that the audience can take back home and reflect on. What would you ask them to do? Yblin, go ahead.
That one is easy. No FPIC, no consent, no mining. Keep that in mind and say strongly to people in your circle of influence, not in my name. Include indigenous peoples in the conversation and ensure that the energy transition does not become a green colonization. Respect indigenous people's rights and be specific. It's not just indigenous people's rights, it's indigenous people's rights to self-determination, indigenous people's rights to free, prior and informed consent, as enumerated in the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Yblin. Thank you so much. Ana Carolina, what can you tell us?
Thank you. So I would say that mining governance is key for a just transition, and that we need a better integration of policies, climate policies with mining policies, with biodiversity policies, and we need to avoid keeping in silos because at the end, this is a global crisis that has many layers, and we need to come together as civil society, but also at the level of government agencies and institutions.
Thank you so much, Ana Carolina, for those thoughts. Emily, over to you.
Yeah, I think what I want to say is that Brazil represents a fantastic opportunity for all of the things that we said, but it's not the only opportunity, so grab every opportunity you see when you get it. But in terms of COPs, this is also potentially just the start of this journey of trying to achieve something, embedded in international law. If I think about other pushes that there's been, such as establishing the Loss and Damage Fund, took about 5 years to get there. And this is the first year that civil society are really coming together to say, right, we need something concrete in here about what the mineral mining is going to look like. Next year, we got another bite at the apple because COP is most likely going to happen in Australia, which is another mineral-rich country, but it also happens to be a country which, next to China, has got an awful lot of international mining operations and quite a lot of bad practices in the back pocket. So let's have another crack then as well and keep going.
Thank you so much, Emily. André, closing with Brazil.
Okay, thank you. So I think I would say that connected with my colleagues, what my colleague said, we need to connect territorial justice with the global agenda of just transition. The energy and the mineral transitions must not repeat the extractive logic that caused the climate crisis in the first place. And they must become opportunities to redistribute power, to ensure that those who protect the land are also those who shape its future. I think this is the most important message for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And before we leave this room, my colleague Ana Alvarado is going to put in the chat as some of the conclusions, some of the points that you have highlighted during your presentation. We will put that in the PowerPoint that you will have translated into different languages. So this is more a message to the audience. So she's doing that now as we speak. So thank you very much for bearing with us. Thank you again to all the speakers, to all the work being done by our team in the background from Tinta and the fantastic interpreters we have. We have one more thing to ask the audience, and there is a link in the chat for your feedback. Your feedback is super important for us to know how do we do things better for you, how do we support you in this journey, what other topics you want us to continue. Of course, we will continue with transition minerals. We will continue working on AI, finance, COP. But if there is something else you would like us to work with you, just let us know. So thank you again. You will all receive the PowerPoint presentation in multiple languages and all the information about the speakers and all the resources they have shared. Thank you so much. Thank you for a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye.